like to welcome people to the Pearson House. The Pearson House. May there always be a Pearson House. It's especially a pleasure for me today. We've been doing this Visiting Writers series for many years. And in a certain sense, yes, they are visitors, but in a certain sense, coming home. Readings today from James Cruz and Travis Mossotti. James was a undergraduate creative writing major and graduated in 2004, and Travis in December of 2005. Overlapping time here. Lots of good work goes on in this building, and I'm very sincere when I say I'd like to see this building here so lots more good work can go on. And that good work is not measured just by some of these visible out in the stream successes of these two writers, who both coincidentally had first books come out in 2011. It's measured by what goes on in these rooms. It's measured by what goes on in these rooms with all of my colleagues, not just the creative writers, but also the folks teaching literature. It's a very integrated program. I'd like to see that continue in this house as long as possible. You really have the sense that that good work that goes on is not just measured in this particular way. I see people in the audience here who are beneficiaries and participants in that good work. People who've come to make their own reading and writing a very real and central part of their lives, regardless of publication, regardless of chit-chat at cocktail parties or anything else, that it has changed lives to know how to read and read better, to learn how to write and write better. And these two gentlemen here are examples of a kind of that magic working. When James first came and I visited with him, he visited with me. He was a transfer student, a fiction writer, so he claimed. And as has happened sometimes before, I didn't actively steal him from my fiction colleagues, but he was effectively stolen, knowing somewhere before I even had a chance to remind him that it is the poet who's closer to the Godhead. James went on to do MFA work at the University of Wisconsin, a very good program, studying with poet Ronald Wallace and other folks there. Travis came also as a transfer of some sort, right? Travis, we didn't have to steal. Travis came in babbling away of poetry and poets, Charles Wright and others. Both of these guys, real readers, both of these guys, especially since that time, even more widely and variously readers. So Travis thought he knew what he wanted, and fiction writers have never stolen anybody. Why? Because the poet is closer to the Godhead. Right? So it's a special pleasure to have these guys here today. James Cruz will be reading first. No, Travis Mossotti will be reading first. And Travis went on after his Webster time. And by the way, it's nothing that we did here that made these guys. If there were contributions, they were more like knowing when to coax, wheedle, admonish, applaud, and mainly when to stay the hell out of their way. Okay? So these people had it in them to start. Travis went on and studied with Rodney Jones and other folks in the MFA program at Carbondale. Both of these guys have logged itinerant and sojourning times on the West Coast, California, Oregon. Travis is now back in the St. Louis area, but both of these poets are St. Louis born and bred. My pleasure then. Travis Mossotti first.
Find some space right there. Ooh. There we go. Yeah, so this is kind of a wonderful homecoming, not just to return to Webster University, but to return to this room. I know David says that you guys didn't make us and whatever, but I can say that neither of us would be who we are without Webster University and without this room, without this building. And we've taken that with us wherever we've gone, West Coast, Lincoln, Nebraska, Southern Illinois. We've taken this building, and anytime anybody asks me about my experience at Webster University, it ultimately comes back to this room and the room behind me, which is as formative as the people I read during my time here. So that's my spiel. And I am in St. Louis, so when the bulldozers arrive, if they do, I will come and chain myself to this building. So they will be responsible for that, the death of a poet, as if poets really need another reason to die young, or an excuse. I'm going to read some poems out of About the Dead. I heard Henry's Blues was up on the flyers, so I'll start with that one. I like this poem. Henry's Blues. My musician neighbor hollows out a piece of sky with his guitar until there's room left for nobody but him. A broken concerto he still lugs around for Angela, his ex-wife, each chord fouling in the attic of his chest. I watched them once through the window. Angela pinched her little castanets like lotus blossoms and danced slow twirls around the kitchen table. Henry, humming whiskey through a harmonica, blessed her sweet can with a spatula while night's ivory sullied outside. That dim memory keeps me listening past dark, listening till there's no music left, till the only recognizable sound is the canter of rail cars passing through the nearby train yard. I did have a neighbor you could spy on voyeuristically. Our duplexes down in Southern Illinois had these big windows in the kitchen, so you could, at night, you know, whether you wanted to or not, you could look out and see what was going on over there. Or whether they wanted you to or not, I suppose would be a better way to put it. I remember when I was here, one of the assignments David had us do to get to know a poet was to do a parody of the poem that we admired. And I remember I did Yeats's Second Coming, and I remember it was something about a barbecue that went wrong, and it was like turning and turning over the widening fire and something. You know, it was an awful parody, but absolutely wonderful at getting to know the poem. The poem in About the Dead that's closest to that is this one. It's called The Second Coming of Christ in the Form of a North American Alligator. Somewhere amidst the reclaimed wetlands between Naples and Fort Lauderdale, a little gator tooths open his shell, crawls out of the womb of mud and stillborn brothers into his mother's mouth and is led directly to water. Nearby, a man in khaki shorts, elastic sewn into the waistband, top shirt buttons undone, remains oblivious to everything but a rusted lug nut. Time and again he pauses to wipe the sweat from his neck with a kerchief, but fails to feel the ground waxing holy beneath him, fails to recognize this new Bethlehem, born in a bed of sweet flag and standing water. This hatchling, sizing things up, tastes the residue of the after and before world still in the air. Rodney Jones, who I studied under at SIUC, was convinced that that poem was the linchpin for this entire, then manuscript, now book. And we spent, I don't know how many times trying to get that ending just right. I had finally given up and was ready to do whatever he wanted with it. And just then, he called me up and said, I figured it out. And he did, so it was good. I'm going to read a poem out of the last section, and then I'm going to come back and read the title poem before I move on to some new stuff. This poem I'm going to dedicate to my mother because she's in the room, and I know it's her favorite poem out of this book, or at least one of her favorites. It was also the first poem that I ever read at a reading when you're a graduate student. If you go on, they'll force you into these graduate student readings where you have to read what you're working on, and oh my God, that is awful, awful pressure. And it usually comes out pretty bad because they're usually first drafts. So this poem was the first poem I ever read at a reading. It's called I Watched Her Going into a Gas Station. Hips rocking like a pendulum, hips with a purpose. She walked like most people wish they could fuck. Spark blonde hair streaked with store-bought lowlights dropping down between her shoulder blades. 6 splendid inches of midriff. A delivery man stacking beer onto a dolly lost his focus. A nervous engine backfired and a case of Keystone crashed across the concrete. A minute later, she came out the swinging doors, cuffing 2 packs of Camels, and slipped on the back of an Indian knee slider with a chrome 4-foot rooster tail, custom-painted skull and bones gas tank, and a set of psycho-chubby ape handlebars. The kid gripping the throttle was about 18, probably a dropout working down at his uncle's garage. He wore black leather in August. The deep-throated engine fired up an avalanche of noise. Watching the 2 of them made me and everyone else there feel that much older. Our lives in Toyota Tercels that much more pointless. They drifted out of the station and roared. I screwed on the gas cap and shuffled toward the swinging doors with an ear cocked to the highway, waiting for them to disappear. I remember David had a revision suggestion on that poem. I screwed the gas cap was how it had, but I screwed on the gas cap. He's like, "What are you doing? Put that on back in there."
Otherwise, your mother would watch that.
No, she was. That was the tipping point right there. I'm gonna read the title poem, then maybe read 1 or 2 new ones. Still gotta. It's called About the Dead. And this is about painting in St. Louis in the art gallery, St. Louis Art Museum. It seemed to have taken on more of a life than when I had originally seen it, and it seems like people like it a lot more. They now have the postcards that you can buy with it on there, and that's always nice. But I just remembered everybody gets their favorite paintings. This was one of mine. At the museum, I stop at a painting. St. Francis contemplating a skull, an upturned human skull nestled in his joined hands, empty sockets contemplating St. Francis. What remains of the dead fascinates me. In Paris, I wandered the catacombs for hours, looking at the bones stacked so neatly. The plagues were so efficient at producing bones to stack. The church's graveyards, dug up and brought by horse cart under moonlight to the vacant sarcophagi of the old Roman quarries. At Père Lachaise, I witnessed a young couple fucking on Jim Morrison's grave. They kept it up for nearly 20 minutes before they were forcibly removed. The man's cock remained a hard, diligent protester, bouncing as they hauled him away over the cobblestone path out of the cemetery, something still locked up inside him. I forgot to mention this last time. That's like the 2 times I used the word fuck in my book. I think, and this pairing, I put them close together. They were actually written back to back. I watched her going into the gas station because, I had to write something to read. But after people responded to it at the reading, I was like, I don't want to take that thing into workshop. They're gonna mess it up. So I wrote another poem about the dead, which then went in as the sacrificial lamb into workshop, and came out better for it. I'm gonna read a Missouri poem real quick. I think that'll be right about my time. It's called Superior Oak Ridge Landfill. Does anybody know the landfill down at Highway 44 and 141? Looks like doesn't quite fit in. I grew up with that, so I'm going to talk about it. Superior Oak Ridge Landfill, Valley Park, Missouri. Sagrada Familia, Gaudi's cathedral in Barcelona, remains unfinished, counting its way up to 18 spires, 12 apostles, 4 evangelists, Virgin Mother, and Jesus. And people in that city have grown up watching it grow up for generations. The architect dead and buried inside. The world turned digital, cellular. The latest phone snapping a picture of a spire. Another amateur who imagines he's got a grasp on things, that he's worldly, that the world is somehow fixed because he's captured an image of it. Steve Jobs died yesterday and will soon be obsolete too. His best products are now leaking radioactively into the sea, incinerated into smoke, or buried in the Superior Oak Ridge landfill, which I'm passing on the highway. Landfill I watched grow up from humble beginnings, smelled it hanging low in the valley for 30 years, every summer, every time I crossed the Merrimack River. So when the news comes that it's finally completed, that the county council has ordered it to stop accepting trash, that it's to be capped with clay and vegetation and monitored for methane levels and leakage, I feel a sense of pride for having watched it grow up to the height of its brothers, for having contributed my small part to it, for knowing that 100 years from now this hill won't be bald and this valley will take back its slopes and the river will go on drifting its dumb course like a mule that never grows old or tired or stubborn. To build a building is one thing, I think, but to build a feature of landscape from garbage is another. And Jobs, Gaudi, Christ sound only like names without owners. What if I told you that when I was a kid I followed the train tracks that brushed past the base of the landfill, hiked up to the rim, looked over and saw an open pit alive with the beating of 1,000 wings, the largest murder of crows I've ever witnessed, rifling in a field of trash that smelled like nothing of this world? Would you imagine now, like I did then, that at any moment that land could have risen into a conspiracy of feathers? We think what we see is only the half of it, that the capped landfill won't outlive Gaudi's cathedral, although it will. That the tallest spire isn't Jesus, after all, just our own ambition in lockstep with a body we can't imagine as disappearing, although it is. And so we build things up higher than the one who came before, and we marvel at the advances until the din of our creation begins to sound like an insect rubbing its legs together, and soon our summer nights are filled with the hum of its mating call. Thank you.
Travis's book about the dead was the 2011 winner of the May Swenson Prize in Poetry, selected by Garrison Keillor, as it happens, who's usually a bit of a cornball for me, but in this case did something right. Okay? It, along with James's book, is available after the reading if somebody would like to take a piece of this day home. James Cruz, coming up next. Also, not just a book that came out in 2011, but winner of the Prairie Schooner Prize in Poetry, and that book called The Book of What Stays. Both of these titles I like. Again, a coincidence that they're both out in the same year and that they're both perhaps here today. It's always about the dead in poetry, and I mean that as sincerely as possible. It's about the dead to the extent that you don't let the dead stay dead, except them dead that should stay dead. And what you bring alive again is other things that have passed and are passing. In the Book of What Stays, you get to decide. It's James's book. He decides what's worth staying and what's staying with in this world. Cruz is currently studying, mainly I like to say hiding out, ducking and covering, in the PhD program in Lincoln, Nebraska. My pleasure again. Mr. Cruz.
put this on. See how I do here. There we go. So thanks, everybody. First of all, I'll try not to get up on my soapbox too much, but coming back to St. Louis and finding out that Pearson House, people are talking about razing it and destroying it, is a little alarming. And like Travis, I don't want to make any threats per se, but having lived in California and Oregon, as you can imagine, I know a few hippies who might be willing to build tree houses and, camp out, have a little Occupy Pearson House maybe. So I would ask the they who are thinking about doing this to keep that in mind. Beyond that, I have to say it's wonderful to be back here. And when I sat in this room with Meg and Anne and various other faculty members and sat in that room in there and workshop, I didn't dare dream that I would be able to come back here and read, but here I am, and it feels really wonderful to be here. And we maybe weren't made, per se, by the program here, but I think the people here know which doors to open for their students, and it's wonderful to watch them in action and to be in this room again that, I always tell my students, I'm maybe a little hippy-dippy for you, but I think when you step in this building, you feel the energy that's just coursing through it, and it's very palpable. So I hope everyone keeps that in mind. Okay, stepping down off the soapbox. For a short time, I taught in a very small town in Eastern Oregon, and it just so happened that I was lucky enough to teach a class in literature of the apocalypse. And so for a while, I was very obsessed with thinking about the end of the world. And that led me to thinking about the book of Revelation. And, it's said to be written by John of Patmos. And I just got to imagining what it would be like to write the book of Revelation and to imagine the end of the world. Like, after that, how do you go on? And so this is my version of that. After Revelation. Long after John received his visions of the apocalypse on the rock-strewn shores of his island exile on Patmos, once that stern voice had thundered down, beckoning him to write and write, after Christ had appeared with his unexpected shock of white hair like a schoolmaster, holy eyes aflame and rolling back inside his haloed head, as the gilt double-edged sword inched out of his mouth, after the throne, the angels that held the wind, after the trumpets, stars crashing to earth and unlocking the smoke-filled abyss, after the locusts and the woman with child appeared in the sky, after the dragon was finally seized, chained, tossed into a sulfurous pool, and all, living and dead, had been judged, the long story recorded, and the world forewarned. As the images John had sworn by most of his life began to thin, receding like evening, swallowed by the calm sea, he must have risen, almost bereft, brushing sand from his sunburned skin and asking himself how to go on living again. Wrath must have started to seem as distant as the Orient as he warmed a pot of salted cod and rice, devouring it with his fingers, smearing the delicious meat across his face, ravenous for the first time in years. As if in a daze, he must have milked the neglected goats who bleated with relief at his tender touch in the gloaming as he recalled the touch, those few bristles of hair on his mother's cleft chin, tickling his lips as she bid him good night. Actually smiling, how could he not have lain unabashed and naked in the creek, scrubbing himself, shivering but amazed at the silver sweet water cascading over every grateful part of him, blistered skin now soothed goose flesh. And when he came home humming, he must have skimmed some cream from the milk pail, lapping it, kneeling down and finding he could not quit, lifting the bucket to his lips and gulping, downing all of it without an ounce of guilt, then stretching out across his straw mat, the sounds of the surf not so much like a crush anymore, but a reprieve. I had to find a way to work in all those strange images from the book of Revelation into a poem. So that was the deal there. This next poem, I read an article about Chernobyl, you know, the worst nuclear disaster ever in Russia. And it was about this woman who had refused to leave Chernobyl. You know, this was her home, so she didn't want to leave. And I've since read that actually Chernobyl is starting to regenerate as far as nature goes. The natural world is taking over again. So the wolves have returned, all of this stuff. And they're not the worst for it, actually. So it's kind of interesting. But I imagine what life was like for this old woman who refused to leave. So this one is called "The Birds Have Not Yet Left Chernobyl." The ancient widow thinks only about this year's harvest and the stories of marauding fugitives. The words radiation and poison wander her mind like the wild boar that trample the stalks of her cornfields and then scamper off into the yellow-gray Ukraine horizon as she cocks and aims her husband's favorite shotgun. But she calls the albino swallows which nest inside the cracked concrete sheath protecting the reactor angels each time they fly down to light in her garden. She sacrifices shrunken heirloom tomatoes to their crooked beaks and spreads seed for them on chipping windowsills. Treading the dense moss floors of the new forests that have reclaimed every crumbling courtyard, she heads to the edge of Pripyat River, where the sage still sells the best mackerel and tells of her husband's afterlife. Done frying dinner, scattering slivers of fish for the birds, she settles in and sips her home-brewed vodka like silver plucked from the underside of the moon. She traces the glow of a few gaslight stars above and does her mending. Tomorrow, when the scientists pick their slow way toward her cottage in masks and plastic orange boots, she will tell them once more she can never leave her native land of Pereshev. She knows the swallows, now gathering one-eyed and bent on the porch rails, are as helpless as children and still need her. She could not live a moment or sleep without their malformed songs. So I suppose poets always care a little bit more where their poems come from than the people listening, but they come from such strange places sometimes. I feel compelled to share those stories. And so this next one originated one night when I was watching the Colbert Report, and got that pronunciation right too. And he had on Jonah Lehrer, who is a neuroscience writer, writes some great stuff, and he was talking about his book, How We Decide, and how, as humans, it's this ability to think about our own thinking that separates us from the primates. And so he calls that metacognition, or I guess neuroscientists call it that. So I got to thinking about metacognition. Neuroscientists insist it is the greatest gift of being human. This ability to take a step back and think about our own thinking, to abandon, for instance, the insistent glare of a grocery aisle, a moment, and climb the mind's Escher-like stairs when faced with those endless shelves of bright cereals, sprouted loaves, and pyramids of trucked-in produce, to ask ourselves, which one, what kind, and how exactly did this basket get so full? But I say any thought about decision can instantly ruin it. Mangles and shunts our wise neurons until their instinctual paths run someplace else entirely, a nowhere door or useless brick wall. Imagine colonies of bees for the first time considering the theory of flight and tumbling down, or the pollen powdering their wings, pondering the shifting winds of the grand scheme, the butterfly effect, its definitive part in stirring up the most devastating tsunami. And what if a blossom began to contemplate pistils and stamens, or inquired of the air, why this wafting scent and then the falling away? If the branch asked, why this wait, this bending and ripening, and then the sudden rip of the picking like a torn tendon? In short, what if the rest of the world became more human? Wouldn't the skin of this plum I have for some reason chosen today simply shrivel and collapse if the flesh started to analyze the nature of all existence, all sweetness and mystery surrendered to the far more grounded, pragmatic pit? What if my hand measured its own shape against this page, if the palm now cradling the plum tried to read the lifelines of itself, if I wondered why the knife, the teeth, or the juice now helplessly finding my chin, if I stopped to ask myself, how much do I actually want this delicious thing? Sometimes I'm grateful the mouth just knows. You can answer that if you want. So this next one is it's another of my apocalypse poems, and this was written around the time when it was at the height of the Iraq War, and it felt like the only news that was coming out was really bad news, and so I felt the need to write something a little more redemptive. So this is called "The Bees Have Not Yet Left Us." With a click, morning news pours heavy into the bedroom, embedding itself with anchors' voices too syncopated and smooth for the tangled math of troop buildups, the surge of death tolls tallied daily now. Forgive me distant wars and local heroes, but I cannot listen. I can only sneak down to the boardwalk and pick unlikely hyacinths on fire in rising light, can only place them lance-like in last night's water glass, as if this one act could save a life or erase the reports of whole colonies of bees lost on the wrong roads between our phone signals. If apocalypse ever shows up, let us then eat only ashen bread and bone-dry tubers. For now, I refuse to let another second tick by, wasted, while he is waiting for me at the table with dishes of fresh blueberries swaddled in cream. I turn off the TV, throw open every window so we can taste the faintly salted breeze filtering in from Humboldt Bay, and trembling the violet petals of these hyacinths I am now holding out to him, until their pollen scatters violently golden before us, this dust and air we are somehow still breathing together. And I often say it's a little odd to read a love poem about someone with whom you are no longer. And I have read poems like that in the same room, and that's even more awkward. So luckily that's not the case today. The next poem I'll read, I'm going to read partly because my mother read it beforehand and she really liked it. So she thought it would be a good one to read. And the epigraph for this is from Rilke. I'm sure most of you know who that is. And it's from his Letters to a Young Poet. So this poet wrote him letters asking for advice. And one of the things he asked for advice on was love. You know, how do I know when it's real? How do I get ready for it? And so Rilke's response, one of his responses, was such a poet thing to say. And it goes, "You must save up for it and collect and gather honey." And so I just thought that was a great response. Probably didn't help the poet in his love life very much, but it helped me write this. So this is called Love. You can collect as much of it as you like. Keep it in trunks under the bed, in closets, or store it in stone jars, as the pharaohs did, placing gallon after gallon of priceless honey next to the alabaster heads of sarcophagi, so when they woke wide-eyed and famished in the afterlife, they'd find something familiar and sweet to eat. But nothing hoarded stays hidden for long. Soon enough, some looter will shimmy into that secret room in you, and, ignoring the warnings, he will pry off the lid of every sighing jar and scoop out the honey, now crystallized, shining in his hands, still delicious after all that time. And of course, that's taken from reality. They have found these jars of honey in the pharaoh's tombs, and you can still eat it. It's crystallized, but it's still edible. Also felt like that should be a poem. Next poem is about a lake in Oregon that I got to spend a month living near and communed with it every day. It was a crater lake, which is created by a volcano collapsing, and then the lake fills with rain. And it turns out that this was a very sacred place to the Native Americans in that area. So I began to imagine the life of this lake in a way. Crater Lake. I dip the mason jar into the melting lake, and the water rushes in, sweet as a medicine I have somehow lived without until tonight. In the half-dark, in the fever of a wolf moon, I move closer to the rim where the walls of this caldera still recall the heat and flow of the volcano it once was. The porous rock remembers the hands that gripped it, the feet that kicked against it to give a swimmer momentum. This lake knows the strokes of every fish fin, the glance and swoop of the heron, the knock of our earthly oars, our voices, but there are still some secrets it must keep. Before capping my jar, more than just a souvenir, I hold it up to the stars and let the water store the scattered rosary of those worn lights. I drink, and then I see the seekers who would come here to swim day and night, opening their eyes underwater to catch the spirits in the act of making that blue world shimmer. And after they touched the gods, reached inward and felt the source of ecstasy, of pain, that single place in each of us, they would rise slowly to the surface and climb out of the lake, now shamans. For hours they would refuse all fire, shrugging off elk skins, leaving their skin bare to the howling wind. I didn't actually do that, but I sat by the lake a lot. So I think I'll read just two more. And this next one, again, telling you where it came from. This next one came from a great quote I came across from Charlotte Bronte. It was in an article about how in America, we're obsessed with this idea of happiness and attaining happiness, all that. And so she says, Charlotte Bronte, "No mockery in this world ever sounds to me so hollow as that of being told to cultivate happiness. What does such advice mean? Happiness is not a potato to be planted in mold and tilled with manure." And I thought, she's right. Happiness is not a potato. But what is like a potato? And so I came up with this: grief. Grief is like a potato. Pray for famine, summon the beetles, beg for mercy. That dark seed will still take root and bloom, the tuber swelling until its starches peak, and you must fall to your knees. Work it from packed earth like a poultice you know you need to heal. Rinse it in light from the moon of flailing phantom limbs, and rub the grit like sleep from eyes that never close, even as you peel and slice and dice. Now anoint it in the oil of a hot skillet until golden, crisp, and eat. You will wish it didn't call for the stinging kiss of so much salt. You will wish it didn't fill you up like this. So we'll try to end on a lighter note here. Although I don't have many light poems now. Now that I'm flipping through the book, I realize that. Let's see. Lighthearted. We'll do, how about, what's that? No, that one's too heavy. Well, you can take it? Okay, good. Yeah, you're good listeners. So thanks again, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it. And again, thanks to David. Travis has been a great companion. We've been reading all over the last couple of weeks, and we have a couple more readings together. So we're a little bit like Laurel and Hardy, traveling around here, poetry style. So last one is called Sex in the Rain. And this is from some graffiti I had seen on one of those old covered bridges that was left in Missouri. And, it was just sex in the rain in red paint. And so, as with many of my poems, I'm imagining, maybe it's the fiction writer still in me, where did that come from? Sex in the rain. I imagined at first some kid and his girl had come to this dank and rotting covered bridge, searching for a dry, hidden place to wait out a summer storm. I thought they must have made love. I wanted to call it love, and then had meant to memorialize it with these words sprayed over the rest of the graffiti, simply sex in the rain, in dripping, fading red paint. But then I let my mind wander back to the dim-lit caves of Lascaux, to the finger of the lone ancient hunter who traced those careful stick figures of stags in blood and ochre. What if it wasn't magic or religion, I thought, but raw hunger that drew what he ached for but could not catch? Instead, I imagined a teenage boy, not unlike myself, skulking off in the middle of an August night so humid he could almost taste his own pulsing need with each new breath. See how his flashlight beam coaxes a glint from crushed cans, cigarette wrappers, and shriveled condoms, and watch as he measures every letter of the most perfect scene he's never dared to conjure. A man next to him, their bodies one shadow as rain begins to tap a beat on the walls of the bridge. He takes out his paint can, shakes it, and he writes it. He writes it big. Thanks, everybody.
I'd like to thank everybody again for coming. Thank you both for being here in a busy schedule. And thank Kenneth Patchen, who said the words 63 years ago, people who profess to love poetry and never buy any, cheap sons of bitches. Both of these books are available here, and again, enjoy the day.